Okay, so we have our blocks all sewn together into a top sans border. I have my 4 corner pieces here, and I have 80 blocks, HSTs total. I have 40 that are purple with the pink, and then I have 40 that are blue with the pink. So what you're going to do is around your quilt is a good place to do it. If you don't have enough room to lay it out, maybe keep your quilt near for reference and just lay these out in a straight line near your quilt, because what you want to do is lay out the blocks alternating between purple and, so that's backwards. So alternating between purple and blue. And so I said it's backwards because I have all mine kind of in groups of directional fabric. And so you're alternating between purple and blue next to the quilt. The pink is always going to be on the outside. So I ended up going with one single blue fabric and one single purple fabric, which was normal to the pattern. When I did this quilt for the original cover quilt, I did scrappy blue with the pink, and then I did the purple with the pink, and I believe I did scrappy pink as well. So this time it's a little bit different, and so I'm going to lay out my borders in this every other manner, lining up so that you're continuing the checkerboard pattern of the purple and the blue. And you also want to pay attention to the direction of your HSTs. The pink is always on the outside of the quilt. So the outside of the border is the pink, and the blue or purple is always on the inside. Luckily, my purple is very non-directional, so I can just kind of pop any of the purples in. But because I'm trying to keep my blue fabric directional, I do have to pay attention to that. So once you get to this middle line right here, for each side, you're going to switch the direction of your border. So I'm actually switching to the blue there, and there we go. See how it switched directions there? So we have like a larger bit of pink, and then the blue is in a different direction than the blue up on the top half. So you're going to do that with each side. I'm going to lay out all my borders, and then we'll pop back on for our corners. Grab the corners. You're going to put your corners. Right now, the point is touching the point of my quilt top, because they're going to have your border, your HST border is going to kind of die into that. So when we sew up our borders, we're going to sew from here to here, the side border, and the same on the other one. And then for the top and bottom, we'll include the corners on the top and bottom borders. So let me get the borders all laid out, and that'll make a little bit more sense for where everything goes, and then we'll pop back on. I have the whole border laid out. So you can see on that side, the border is much longer than on this side. So that's because I laid the border out on this side end to end to demonstrate, and it goes down 3 below. So there's 3 blocks down below this one. So that's to demonstrate when you're laying out blocks next to something similar that's already sewn together, it's going to be bigger. So don't let that freak you out. Once you sew all those seams together, it will be the same size. What you want to do, if you're doing it that way, is just make sure that you're kind of calculating how many, and then that they're every other. So on each half, from the middle up and from the middle down, you want to count how many. There's 10. And so you want to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then we switch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You want to make sure they're all going in the same direction, those groups of 10. And then we are alternating, starting with these two. We want those to be the opposite. And then if you're alternating all the way down, you should be fine, even if it's longer. You'll see on the other 3 sides that the borders look the same, and that's because I just overlapped. Because my board here is flannel, it holds the block, and so I just kind of stuck them on top of each other to make sure that we're coordinated with the colors, that they're every other. And when I get to the middle here, I switch directions of my HSTs. So what we're going to do now is we are going to go and sew those borders together. So the 2 side borders, you are sewing from the top of this quilt section to the bottom. These solid corner blocks or single fabric corner blocks are going to go on your top borders. So you're just literally going to take these 2 and sew them together along the edges that touch. Open them up and sew on the next one, and continue down and sew them all together. It takes a little bit of time because you're sewing just short blocks together. I would backstitch on these on the outer edge, which is always the side that has the pink on it, because that's going to be the outside edge of your quilt, and we do not want it to pop any of the seams. So take your pile of squares starting from the top and just pile them on top of the next one down, and continue down your path all the way. And then you'll have a full stack of all the squares you need for this border. And we know we want to keep the orientation of this pile correct. So you could put a clip on the top to remember, or just remember the orientation of the HST with the pink fabric and the purple fabric, and then literally sew them back together in a column. So I'll take you to the sewing machine and show you how to do that. This is the only one, the sides, that are slightly more tricky because you are sewing them in a column format instead of in a row format, which is what we've done all along. The top border and the bottom border we will sew in a row. Even if we stack them like this, we are then going to sew them in, these directions, going sideways instead of going up. So I'm going to take you to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew together a column for our left border on the quilt. You can also follow the diagram in the quilt pattern. I'm pretty sure it's page 13, 14, somewhere around there. There's diagrams for each border in the pattern. So if you are not able to lay it out like this, you can follow the diagrams in the pattern. We're at the sewing machine. I brought over the stack, and I'm trying to make sure I keep it in the correct orientation. This is the top of the top square on our left side border. So there's 2 things you could do. You could leave it in this orientation if things like that confuse you, like if you forget that you're going to turn it, which is another suggestion. Then leave it like this. Take one square, take your next square, and they go like this in the column. flip it right sides together, and sew along this edge. But we have to turn it to sew it. So just remember that. Your top square is the bottom square in the column as we work. So in this orientation, I would not backstitch on that end, but I would backstitch on this side. So then we're gonna, remembering our top square is the bottom in the column. So that is opening back up. This is how our column continues. We can take the next square and then continue adding it, just like that. Opening it back up and keeping the pink on the left of the border, keeping this, it might be good to pop a pin or a clover clip on your top square. Another way you can do this, so maybe the sewing doesn't seem too confusing. So remember, we're going to take our next block and put it like this. Let's turn everything, what is it, 45 degrees. So this is the top of our stack, and we just turned it so the top is on the side. Now instead of a column, we have a row, and then we are just going to take this, because we turn the top to the side, and we know that the top goes towards the bottom. So it's a little bit easier. You can leave this continuing out to the left. So open this back up, and then our next one is already in position as we pull it down. So that's a way to easily do the columns on the sides. If for some reason this flipping the orientation of your stack and your column into a row confuses you, don't do it that way. But the general consensus is it might just be a little bit quicker. The other thing to remember is you have, for the cover quilt size, you have 10 squares before you get to flip. So kind of keeping track, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of where you are in the stack will help you determine if you have stacked them properly, and if something has gotten flipped around when you get to your 10th HST or square, you will know that the 11th one needs to go in the opposite direction, and if it doesn't, that there's something wrong. So it's good at that point to double check your border to your quilt top again and make sure that everything is correct. So that was 10, and you can go back and count. So now I know that the next one, number 11, has to be flipped the opposite way. And I can see right now that it is, and so I am going to just continue sewing. And just keeping an eye on, if you're following the cover quilt, to make sure that you're going every other with your purple and blue fabric so that that stays correct. Okay, so we have our row, but we're just going to turn it, and it is our column. Our little clip here is telling us that this is the top. So in my opinion, the borders on the side are the hardest ones to sew, because you just have to remember the orientation of them, since they're a column, a border going vertical instead of a horizontal. But really, it wasn't hard. I hope you see that when you're watching. I'm just going to pop a pin in there. Now we can see that everything lines up good, and we could technically sew this border directly to the quilt right now, but I'm going to sew my other borders first. If for some reason you got off somewhere in your sewing, if you weren't paying attention, or just, you know, sometimes somebody distracts you and you might end up with two blues right next to each other, but you don't realize it until you're down here and you come back and you're like, oh no. Don't worry, you don't have to pick apart the whole thing. What you could do is, if this was actually seamed, and so at this point it would end with a purple, like if we had a purple at the bottom, if that was seamed there. All you would have to do is pick apart these two and then take the purple off the bottom and re-sew the purple in between those two. You don't have to pick apart everything. It might be pretty obvious, but to some people it may not. So pay attention, because of the way these borders are, being every other fabric, it's probably pretty simple if you made a mistake in sewing the HSTs together. And if for some reason you have very directional fabric and you got the orientation of the fabric wrong, this border might be able to swap to a different border. So check that out and just move the squares from a different border, because a lot of these squares can go on multiple sides of the quilt, even with directional fabric, because we have two different directions of HSTs on each side. So it means there's at least two spots around the quilt on two different sides that those HSTs can go. So always double check that before you unpick all your seams, that your border won't work on another side if something happened with the direction of the fabric. And if something happened with one of these getting out of place, just kind of take a step back and take a look and see if you can just unpick one or two and flop some things around and get it back into the correct space. The other thing that is a possibility with these borders, but it takes a little bit more planning / I would say really paying attention when you're sewing, is if we stacked all 4 of our borders, we could chain piece them. So what that means, remember chain piecing when we sewed 2 squares together and then, well, you might not have, but I demonstrated. We sewed 2 squares together and we didn't cut here to start sewing this square on. Instead, we sewed the next 2 for our next row, and then we sewed the next 2 for our next row, and then so on. You can do that same thing with the borders by stacking them in order, laying the blocks, if you have 3 stacks, because that's what we have left, let's say, or you have 4, making sure they're stacked in the correct orientation, and then you sew the first 2 squares from the first border together. You sew the first 2 squares from the second border together, and you sew the first 2 squares from the third border together. Now, in this instance, I would backstitch on both sides because you're going to want to snip all of these borders apart. So in theory, then you would go back and sew the third square on the first border to the first 2 squares, the third square on the second border to the first 2 squares, and the third square on the third border to the first 2 squares. So you're chain piecing these borders all together. And so it saves a little bit of time. Not that that border took us very long at all. With my faster machine, it took me like 6-ish minutes, and I was explaining it to you or demonstrating. I wouldn't say you're going to be that fast because, you know, new quilter, new sewer, and your machine is probably not as fast as the Juki that I sew on, but you'll gain speed over time. So you could chain piece the borders together. I am going to stack my top border, my bottom border, and my last side border. I'm going to take you to the machine. I'm going to show you just the beginning part of that chain piecing, just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Again, it is a method that is faster, yes, but it takes a little bit more just being cognitive of what you're doing, not zoning out, because you need to keep track of which row is which, and you could pin a little paper on each to tell you, but you also need to keep track of the top and bottom row compared to the side border, because the side border is a column, not a row. So I'm going to stack these up. We're going to go to the machine. I'll give you a brief little synopsis of that, and then we'll come back, show the borders on the quilt and how to sew them to the actual quilt, which again, not hard. So let's get at it. Okay, before I set up to sew, I just wanted to demonstrate. This is my top border, this is my side border, and this is my bottom border. So I am sewing the top and bottom borders horizontally. So this will go onto this one with those two sides. But I'm sewing the side border vertically. So this will go onto that side. Now I could again rotate this middle one only so that it will go side to side. That's probably what I'll do. And then I'll just remember how I changed it, maybe put a clip there, and that will also tell me it's the middle one, so that as I'm sewing, I can easily grab and know what side I'm putting it on. I might end up moving these over there as well. We'll see. I'm going to get the sewing machine set up and we'll sit down and sew. So I did move my stacks, and let's grab a clip here. I did turn this, so this is the top edge, and the edge to the right is going to be the edge that I always sew to. So I'm going to take my first 2 squares from the top, and because I'm sewing the top and the bottom horizontally, I am just going to put them down in a horizontal line, knowing that these are the 2 I need to sew together. So I'm going to flip them right sides together and sew with a back stitch on either side. So I'm not going to cut, and I'm going to grab the next 2. So kind of keeping an eye on the orientation, but I know that this is the top of my column, and I know which way my HSTs have to point. So flipping these 2 together to sew, back stitching at the back and front, or top and bottom, I guess. 3rd border, grabbing the top and then putting the next one next to it, right sides together, back stitch, and then cutting. That's all that we're going to be sewing for our first single seam. So then we're going to open each of these up and kind of looking at orientation here, because this is our top and we know this is the direction the HSTs go. We know that the bottom, the HST has to go in the opposite direction. And then this is our column on the side. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the next square from the top stack, and we're going to turn it right sides together. Back stitch. The next square from the middle stack, and you can do this. You can lay it next to make sure the orientation is correct. If you know, just then place it down right sides together and don't worry about checking. But to get started, it is always good to repeat those habits to get used to it. And then we take the next square from our bottom stack and we flip right sides together and sew them together. This saves a little bit of time because you're not clipping and restarting threads every square for each row, and it also does save thread. So then we're going to open them up, just continuing to make sure we are at every other color on each individual border, and that the top and bottom stay opposite. The middle is kind of moot for that. So we're just going to continue down the line, adding from each stack to each border, and it should be pretty easy to keep track of because there's only 3, so you can see top, middle, bottom. And since I'm on the middle, I grab from my middle, make sure it is not the same color if you're doing the every other method as the one that you're putting it on top of, and continue down. So you're going to go through the whole stacks like this, the whole 3 stacks, and sew them all into their borders just like this. And then when you get to the end, on the top and bottom, you're actually going to have, they're longer than the middle one. So just keep that in mind. We'll cut to the end and then I'll tell you what to do next. This one actually goes under here. So because I am to the end where I have 2 more squares to attach to just the top and bottom, I can just sit back and scoot this one up and ignore the middle one on this one. And not a big deal at all because we're going to be clipping those threads. Now you would not want to do that if you're actually chain piecing like a full quilt together. Never try never to forget a row because that will be not good. But in this case where we're just using chain piecing as a method to speed up our piecing, it is totally fine to do that. Okay, so we are done. Oops. We have all 3 rows sewn to each other, or borders, I guess. So now what you're going to do, and there are gizmos for this, it's like a little stand with a blade, and you can just literally go through and pop the seam onto the blade and it cuts it. You can also lay this out on a long flat surface and just cut all those threads kind of like this, except I'm just scooting through. I mean, I'm not even really doing much. I'm not even really cutting. I'm just giving a little bit of pressure against the blade of the scissors and it's cutting because the thread is easy to cut. So you're just going to cut all of these apart, keeping track as you go so that you remember when they're apart what is what. So I'm cutting off the bottom. This is my bottom. So I'm going to set that over to my left and then I'm going to just scoot it all back through and then do it again for the other 2. Cut them all apart. Okay, so, and then I know that the one with the clip is my side. So this is actually the top. This is my top border. So this is the top of the side is what I was trying to say. This is my top border. And then I have my bottom border over here so I have them sandwiched top, middle, bottom. And we're going to go back and put them in place over by the quilt top. My top, I don't know if it's going to stay. I'm going to grab a pin. And the purpose of putting it back up here is purely just to make sure all of our fabrics are in the right spot. This is our side with our little clip. And then our bottom. So again, I wouldn't have to pin these all back in place. I could totally just kind of glance at them, but it gives me a view of the whole quilt to make sure that everything is in the right space. Now, because these are not ironed yet, I had to stretch it a little bit to sew it, to pin it up there. But once it's sewn on, it's going to be fine and we're going to iron it and it's going to be great. I am going to sew on the side borders first. So basically what I'm going to do, let's take this little clip off. While it's up here, I'm going to take this. I'm going to flip it right sides together, aligning the edges that I want to sew together. And I'm going to just pin it in the spot in just a couple places. And you can pin it again at the bottom if you would like. I'm going to do the same thing for this side. Take it, flip it right sides together, and pin it in place. And then you can just do another pin, somewhere in the middle is kind of what I've been did on that side. And a tip for your pins when you're pinning, this is the edge I'm sewing on, and so when I'm sewing, most of the quilt is going to be to the left of the presser foot. So I want my pins, the point of my pin, to be pointing towards the presser foot. So think about that in orientation of which way your pins go in. You want to be able to easily pull it out as the point of the pin is going towards the presser foot. I am going to sew the two sides on, and then we'll come back and sew the top and bottom on because they have the extra square, the corner setting squares, basically. I believe it's called a setting corner or setting square when you're doing sashing your borders like this. So we're going to go back to the sewing machine and then come back here and back to the sewing machine, and then we'll be done. We're so close with our quilt top. We still have lots to do. We're going to make a backing, baste it, quilt it, bind it, all of that stuff. Okay, we're back at the machine. We have our first side to sew. We're going to back stitch at the top. We're going to take out that pin where it was stuck in. And then all you want to do as you're sewing down the side is make sure these seams of your border are nested with the seams of your quilt top behind. Whichever way the seams on the block or the quilt top are going, you want the seam on your border to go in the opposite direction to nest. So just kind of finger it as you go and feel that and nest them together. And like I said before, as you move along the opposite blocks, your border, your seams will switch direction. I've just switched direction for this second block in the quilt top. And I'm getting to the middle where I have another pin. I can take that pin out and again nest those seams. And I switch directions for my seams again. Some of these seams might have a little bit more bulk because we're going to have seam from the angle and the seam from where it's connected to the next HST. So if we're folding that on top of each other, it's a little bit bulkier. So that's okay. We would rather have our seams nest than fold it the opposite direction because it's going to have the same amount of bulk either way. If you fold it the opposite direction, it's going to be bulky because you have the seam on the other side going in the same direction. And if you don't fold it in the opposite direction to save on that bulk, so it's better to have them nest than to worry about the bulk at this point. Okay, so we have our first border sewn on and everything looks good. It's so exciting to see it come all together. Our next border is on the opposite side of the quilt, and because of the direction we want our fabric to go through our sewing machine, we're going to flip this upside down. So we're going to start at the bottom of the quilt because we want the quilt to be to the left of the foot so we can align the edge that we're sewing with our guide, whatever that guide may be. So it's no different than sewing it from the top down, aligning the corners, doing our back stitch, and then nesting our seams. It is definitely good to remember that our horizontal row seams, the seams that are connecting our rows together, all are facing the bottom of the quilt. So as we come to where two blocks are connected, we want to just make sure that the fabric of that seam is being fed through at the proper direction. Sometimes with different surfaces on our foot, it can tend to push a seam that is pointing towards the foot. It can tend to lip it up or give it a little bump or something. And we just want to be cognizant of that. The seams underneath that end up pointing towards us instead of towards the foot naturally just continue pointing towards us as they glide through. If ever you get to the point where this seam and this seam are a little bit off, like this one is actually a little bit farther, you just want to kind of bump them up next to each other so the seams are nested, and then you're just going to do a gentle tug to ease those fabrics together, and it'll all work out. If there's a lot of extra fabric somewhere, that's not going to work, but anything less than 1/4 of an inch, you're going to be able to ease that fabric out as you kind of just give a little bit of stretch to it. Take our last pin out and aligning this seam and the corner, we can just go to the end. Okay, we're back to our board. We can see our top and bottom border there. We are going to just pin this up real quick to take a peek at it. We haven't ironed these yet, so don't worry about that. We'll iron it all at the end. We are going to pull that top border right sides together down onto the top edge. Just pin kind of in place. Don't worry about it being too exact. I'm on my tippy toes here, guys, in case you were wondering. Second border, corner. Just pop it back up there. We're going to do the same with the bottom. We're just going to flip it up, but so you can see it kind of fell down like there. We're going to take this to the machine and sew those top two borders on the exact same way we just sewed the side borders on, and then your quilt top is done, except for our victory lap and ironing. So not really done, but close. All right, we are popping it in. We have all of our quilt going to the left of the machine, and we are making sure those corners are aligned. Let's take out that pin, and then we're going to just float down this edge and stitch it all together. With this border on the back, I just had my seam come in because that felt more natural than trying to push the seam towards all of these thicker seams. So coming in towards the middle of the quilt for that first intersection of the first seam there. Not super hard, not super easy. All right, we have our top border attached. That's super exciting. Let's flip it all around to get to our bottom border and sew that on. So you're missing out on all the flipping because I scooted you in real close. Again, we know that we want this seam to come in towards the middle of the quilt because that's the border seam, and after that we just follow the seams of the individual blocks in what way they're pressed. And now that I say that, I did not pay attention at the end of my top border to know which direction that final seam was going, so I really hope I got it in the right direction. Taking out the pin for the middle as I get to it. By the end of this video, you may note the difference in the lighting in my room. Okay, we are coming to the end. I want to remember that this seam should point towards this fabric, towards the middle of the quilt. I'm going to take out that last pin so I can nest my last seams and get that corner aligned. And do my last back stitch. Okay, I switched to viewpoints on ironing. Sorry you can't see my face, but I wanted to get more light, and if I stand where I normally stand, I'll block all the light. So what I am doing now, okay, so I have you in a little bit closer so you can see I am coming along the edge here, and I am going to iron all of the seams for the borders down in the direction that they're sewn. And as I do that, I can iron my seam attaching my border to my top in towards the quilt, which is what we wanted it, what direction we wanted it to go. So it's kind of twofold. The trick with these seams, because we're ironing them now, is to just make sure that all the other seams do not get ironed up from what they should be. And now we had to switch directions because we got to another block. So the seams are going to be ironed vertical now. I mean, this isn't the most ideal situation to have all the seams on each block going in different directions, but it's just kind of how this worked out. We're switching back and we are ironing in the opposite direction again. So we're just kind of going back and forth, ironing the seams in the direction they're sewn into the seam, and we are making sure that the seam connecting the border goes towards the quilt. And then the next border, the top border, we are going to be ironing towards the quilt as well. So as I'm ironing now the top border, I will switch it to this direction, but we're going to try and just iron the seam connecting the top border in towards the quilt as well. Okay, we have a finished quilt top. We have our borders on. Hopefully nothing is wrong. It is ironed, which makes a world of difference. I hope these videos so far have been super helpful. I hope it's super, super, super exciting to finish your first quilt top, or maybe one of your first quilt tops. We are going to be learning next week how to make a backing for your quilt, how to cut batting or keep it in the size that you purchase it in. And then we're going to baste our quilt to the batting and the quilt back and get it ready for quilting. So we have a few things left to do to make our quilt complete, but I'm so excited for you. I'm so excited that you've gotten to the point where you're finishing up your quilt top. It is such a big accomplishment. Good job. We'll see you next week.